Welcome to another episode of Everything Digital Health. This evening I'm recording using the integrated camera on my laptop, so apologies for the slightly poor video quality, but I'm going to be sharing my screen anyway, so that's the main thing you're going to be looking at. And today I'm going to be talking about open source, which is something that I've only talked about once so far on this channel, which some of you might find surprising because I'm known as a bit of an open source enthusiast, evangelist, or zealot, depending on what your opinion on open source is. But I'd noticed that the NHS England open source policies, of which there were at least 3 places that there were policies, they've been removed. So firstly, let me just talk a little bit about my beliefs about open source, and I've written this blog which is linked to in the show notes, but it talks about open source is the only way for medicine, and the main justification I have for that kind of slightly stark claim is that if you don't have open source things, you end up with the Chamberlain forceps. So Chamberlain forceps were obstetric forceps which had been invented several hundred years ago by a family called the Chamberlains, and they kept the existence of these obstetric forceps secret. But we know from diagrams and from actually the discovery of the real ones that they were very similar to the obstetric forceps that were then reinvented sort of 150 years later. And because those forceps were kept secret, it allowed the Chamberlains to exploit the maximum profit from their invention, sure. But during the period that they were secret, we can only imagine how many mothers and children died from obstructed labour because of the absence of the invention of an instrument for instrumental delivery. And that sort of thing will happen again with software unless we make it open source. If we've got important developments in software, new pieces of software, especially with the advent of clinical calculations and scoring systems and tools and risk stratification and genomic tools, if they are all closed source, we will get to a point where we basically, even in rich countries, we won't really be able to afford them all. And so your ability to have healthcare will be limited by your budget. And significantly limited, because these things will never become generic either. They're copyrighted. They're not going to be like drugs. They're going to behave very differently. So I will come back to open source is the only way for medicine in another episode, and I will come back to digital generics in another episode as well. Today I wanted to focus on this slightly surprising discovery that I had today, which is that NHS England have taken down some of their website content that has their open source policies in there. And a few people that I've spoken to about this have said, don't always assume that it's bad intent. It could just be cock up rather than conspiracy. And that's a fair point. So I'm not insisting that this is deliberate, but I think that we deserve better as a community of NHS technologists. I've had a minor rant about all this on Blue Sky. If you are part of that platform, you can go on there and read some of the further details. But this is what I'm really talking about. NHS England digital technology open source policy is now a 404 page. So it's just been taken down. If you search for open source, you can't find it. So it's not that it's just been moved, it's been deleted. This is what it used to look like. If you go on the Wayback Machine, you can see lots of discussion about the benefits of open source, all written very much like somebody actually understood it in their organisation and took on board some of the serious improvements that open source can bring. And certainly with the NHS being a very high user of software, but having a massively fragmented market, having a few open source solutions that everybody can have would actually raise all the boats. Every trust would be able to have the open source PAS system, If it was produced by the NHS, just everybody would have it. It would become standardized. In fact, open source is a way to get standardization, especially in fragmented markets where you can't really mandate things. You just make someone an offer they can't refuse. You essentially produce an open source platform that's free, and then if there's an open source alternative compared to paying money for something, most trusts are going to say, well, let's at least try the open source one, and if it fits the bill, fulfills the needs, then you don't need to pay. Sadly, there is also another page that's been removed. So this now says blueprinting, but where the URL I went to was actually this transform.england, .nh.uk, digital playbooks, open source digital playbook. And this all comes from a period of time when NHS England were terribly, terribly excited about the word playbook. And so everything is a playbook. I don't agree that this is a playbook. This is a picture book. This is a scrapbook. It shows you some things that are going on or were going on across the NHS in open source. Lots of I want to, and as a user, I need that. I think they got infected with a sort of thought process there. But forgiving them of that, let's just focus on what they were trying to do here. So they were bringing together some of the things that were open source, some good stuff that was done in COVID that was open source. Interestingly, the Yorkshire and Humber Care record was meant to be open source, but actually the underlying platform does not appear to be open source anymore. Last time that anybody checked, which was just in the last few weeks. Open Eyes, which was an open source ophthalmological system. We've got Odoo, which is an ERP platform. Interesting, the future NHS collaboration platform is down here, and that didn't quite pan out. So some of this stuff that's in here might have actually been jumping the gun a bit, because I don't think these all panned out. But long story short, the entire page is gone, and it's now pointing to global digital exemplar blueprinting, which is something that's really from 10 years ago. And to be quite frank, I'm not convinced that blueprinting really does allow organizations to sort of copy each other's success, because it only allows them to do that if they've got exactly the same amount of cash to go and buy exactly what the other organization had. And I don't think that's necessarily a realistic view of how it works in the NHS. Lots and lots of waffle about blueprinting, but I'm a non-believer, I'm afraid. If you wanted to make things propagate across the NHS, then do things in completely in open source, and then cash is taken out of the equation. You generally can just have the platforms that other trusts are using, set them up in a similar way, share lessons learned, share code, shared plugins. You can get a lot of standardization for a very little money if you actually do open source properly. NHSX still has a GitHub organization page, and they still have an open source policy in there. It will become officially available in summer 2022. So this is not even that old, but the rest of the organization has already completely forgotten about NHSX, to the extent that it's just left the organization there, probably lost access to it. But they've removed everything from the rest of the websites. Just in case they ever do take this down, I've got my own fork of the open source policy, which will remain public even if the other one goes 404. Let's just come back to the future NHS platform whilst we're on GitHub, because it turns out they did start writing the open source new future NHS platform for communities working across health and social care in England. Great. And the idea was that was going to be like a replacement for NHS Futures. Let's just see where that goes. So that goes nowhere. This is actually NHS Futures, or it is now called Futures. And it's still running on Cahoots, which is a proprietary platform that costs a fortune. this is how much it costs. I presume we're going to be on, something like the Enterprise or possibly the Strategic. NHS does love a bit of strategic commissioning, doesn't it? So that means we're paying, it's got to be something in the region of 10 quid per user per month. I don't know how many users are on Future NHS, but I would imagine it could easily be 50,000 people, 100,000 people. It's a lot of middle management and trust management and GPs, people across every part of the NHS. And so you don't have to be that imaginative to work out how much Cahoots are making. Cahoots is a private company and it's owned by one person. So somebody's making quite the money out of this. Interestingly, I was a long time ago in talks with the NHS Futures people about just making this entire thing into a discourse forum, which would have dropped their costs by several orders of magnitude. Because it doesn't matter how good your discourse is, it is not going to cost you like 12 million quid a year. You're talking tens of thousands of pounds. This is, it's madness. Anyway, so failed open source. They didn't go to open source. They're still on the closed source one. Just want to come on to when things are policy and then they decide they're not policy. I think it's only polite that we get some kind of notification about it. So NHS England just decided to delete the damn thing. I was part of what NHS England used to call very proudly its open source community, its open source ecosystem. I went to lots of events about open source. I ran events about open source. And this is a kick in the teeth for anyone who was part of the NHS's open source community, because all of a sudden the NHS's open source policy is just deleted. This is what we should have had. I mean, a dated, named post from an actual person explaining why, in this case, the common user interface is being deprecated. That's another episode, because actually it's a real shame that it was never replaced. But this is what I would call an appropriate level of politeness to your community, to explain what it was, why it's not necessary anymore, and remove it. That's just good manners. Finally, I'll just come on to what we're missing out on with open source. The NHS is a multi-billion pound organisation that has got no ability to understand open source in its tech leadership. If you go to LinkedIn or NHS England's web pages and look at who its tech leadership is, you'll probably find out the reason for that. One, they're actually technically very inexperienced people. They're clinically inexperienced people. It beggars belief that some of these people have ever been allowed to be in charge of the NHS's platforms, but they somehow get in there. Canonical is the company that produces Ubuntu, which is a type of Linux, and they are obviously somewhat biased in the area, but they are providing an insight into a Linux Foundation report here that talks about essentially the incredible amounts of money that you can save by using open source. And, in a nutshell, what used to be the picture of open source was, it's a free version of something that you could get that's paid. Now they are actually part of our core infrastructure. And if you look at virtually every piece of hardware and software that runs the entire web infrastructure, they are all running open source. So big data centers, they're all running open source. The hardware and the routers, the Internet of Things, all open source. Android, open source. There's lots and lots of very important open source projects that now are just the de facto standard. So it allows for standardization. It makes the platforms propagate more rapidly. It means that you can get hold of expertise in running certain of these platforms because there is standardization. So it's not just, Linux is not just, oh, it's a free Unix. It has now completely obliterated all the paid Unixes, because you'd have to be utterly mad to be paying for a Unix when Linux exists. Here's another article that talks about the open source industry booming and that it's a good place for investment. So it's really difficult to understand why the NHS can't see this. Is it being badly advised? Is it being forced down a proprietary avenue? We've tried bringing grassroots projects to the NHS, and in several cases they either get shut down or they get ignored. I just think that it's not for us to drive this. Our leaders should be leading, and that to me means they should be investing in open source. The NHS should have its own open source program office, for example. The NHS should have a skunkworks that allows it to build and develop its own open source projects, and gradually they might evolve and mature into things that can replace tired, old, expensive stuff. And that doesn't mean we'll spend less necessarily. It means that we can save the money that we're using to buy boring things like a patient administration system, and use that money to build the new shiny things like genomics platforms and things like that. So, this is all very realistic. Anyone who thinks that open source is for madmen, weirdos, and hippies needs to get into 2025, because that attitude is not only offensive, but it's just plain old wrong. So that's a little rant for your Tuesday evening there. I do think this is a mistake, and I would like to see, firstly, an explanation of what's happened. Is it cock-up or conspiracy? And secondly, some kind of restitution. I think the NHS does need an open source policy. It needs an open source leader. And, why is it taking them so long to realise this, that, they need technically adept leaders? I'll leave it there for now. This has been an interesting one to do. Just a quick rant, really, about open source policies being taken down. If you've got this far, well done you, and I'll see you in the next one.